A quiet town is racked with terror as police hunt a killer who preys on young women. A vague description and inadequate clues are all they have. The next move is up to him. Someone took great pains to try to dispose of a body. Stripped of her identity, this victim can't lead detectives to her killer. Any chance of justice must be found in the dead woman's hands. A dark night, a sharp curve, and a woman lies dead at the bottom of a canyon. It looks like an accident, but maybe that was the plan. Most people don't kill unless they're certain they can get away with it. Murderers always believe they can outwit the police. And that's their fatal error. In the late night hours on Tuesday, November 23, 1982, police in Morris County, New Jersey were visited by the mother and co-worker of 18-year-old Amy Hoffman. Amy had failed to return from her job at a nearby mall. Amy's mother told police that her daughter worked at the dress store 2 nights a week. She was on her high school cheerleading team and was saving to go to college to become a chiropractor. Amy's co-worker said that Amy helped her lock up. It was around 9:30, and they were among the last at the mall. When Amy failed to return home, her mother went to the mall to look for her. Her car was the only one in the lot. Her keys were in the ignition. Amy's book bag, purse, and wallet were all on the seat. But there was no sign of her daughter. Frantic, Mrs. Hoffman called Amy's co-worker. The two didn't know where else to turn. Police responded to the mall parking lot with a canine handler to track Amy. Her scent trail went cold 2 parking spaces away. Evidently, she left the mall with someone else. But who? The parking lot yielded no clues. According to Morris County Detective Sergeant John Kennecom, neither did Amy's car.
We searched the vehicle, as we do routinely, for fingerprints, any type of items which may assist us in the missing person, but we ultimately didn't find anything.
But that was about to change. 2 days later, on Thanksgiving Day, a man out for an afternoon walk in a secluded area of Morris County, New Jersey, made a startling discovery. The lifeless body of a young woman. He fled the scene and called police. Responding deputies from the Morris County Sheriff's Department found the victim lying in an abandoned water retention tank. From the description, police knew they had found Amy Hoffman. She had suffered multiple stab wounds. The body was removed and sent off for further analysis. Investigators began scouring the area for clues, looking for anything that might help them identify Amy's killer. Bloodstains were recovered near the tank, but later tests showed they belonged to the victim. Evidence technicians gathered all that they could. Sometimes the most valuable clues masquerade as ordinary litter. The autopsy had a little more information to offer. The victim had been stabbed repeatedly and had most likely bled to death. There were indications that she'd also been sexually assaulted, but no biological evidence was found. Fibers and bits of foam padding clinging to her boots and clothing were the only potential evidence collected. Hoping for more information, police returned to the mall to question other employees.
I need to ask you some questions.
One woman stated that when she left the mall around 9 p.m., she saw a creepy-looking man just sitting there in his car. She thought the vehicle was an old Chevy. She only caught a glimpse of the man's face. She could not offer police a detailed description. Investigators knew they would have to work quickly.
We knew we had a major offender in our community. We knew we had somebody that was a predator. And what motivated me, as well as all the other law enforcement officers who worked in this case, is we had to capture this guy before he killed again.
But 2 weeks after Amy Hoffman was murdered, a truck driver parked at a rest stop 20 minutes from the Morris County Mall was jolted from his sleep. A terrified young woman was begging for help. She was bleeding badly and barely clinging to life. The truck driver called police. Though she'd lost a lot of blood, 25-year-old Deirdre O'Brien was still conscious when the paramedics came. She told authorities that less than 1 mile from her home, a car forced her off the road. Fearing the driver of the other vehicle had been hurt in the accident, she went to see if he was okay. He brandished a knife and forced her into his car, an old Chevy. He drove her to the rest stop, sexually assaulted her, and then stabbed her repeatedly. Deirdre O'Brien would not survive her injuries. She died at the hospital, but not before giving a description of her killer.
The victim of the second homicide advised law enforcement officers that the assailant was in fact a white male. He was about the same size as the victim, that he had blue jeans on and a certain type of shirt. It was a Western type shirt.
The suspect and his vehicle matched the description of the suspect in the Amy Hoffman case. With only tiny synthetic fibers recovered from Deirdre O'Brien's clothing, investigators went to the site where she had been abducted to search for more clues. They found a tire track left in the dirt. It was photographed, and then a cast was carefully made. To preserve the impression, forensic investigators use a durable casting medium called dental stone, originally formulated for making dental casts. It sets up quickly and is more durable than traditional plaster. While the tread was only one potential clue, it was the strongest.
Most energy was put onto the tire track itself, because we could see where its location, approximately 4 feet from the victim's vehicle, that it was probably the suspect's tire.
The cast and photographs of the tread were sent to forensic tire expert Pete McDonald.
And I looked at the tread design guide book and found that there were maybe 20 different imprints similar. However, the Cyberling Snow Power tire looked the most consistent.
Detective Sergeant Kennecom carried the photo of the tread impression to shopping malls, neighborhoods, and junkyards. But he couldn't find a single tire like the one Pete McDonald described. Investigators were driven to find the killer before the killer found victim number 3.
Where it occurred?
But then a call came in. There'd been another stabbing. Investigators in Morris County, New Jersey struggled to solve the homicides of 2 young women. All of the clues pointed to a serial killer, but none pointed to a suspect. As investigators raced to identify a suspect before he could strike again, another stabbing was reported. This time, the victim was a man, but the details were familiar. 34-year-old James Kodadich told police that while he was driving, he was pulled over by an early model Chevy with a flashing blue light on the dash. The driver of the other car pulled him out of his vehicle and stabbed him. Kodadich fought off his attacker and fled to his mother's house. His description of the assailant resembled the murderer at large. To police, James Kodadich was fortunate. His wounds were not serious. An ambulance came to take him to the hospital. Before leaving, he gave the police permission to examine his car for any trace evidence his attacker might have left. Hoping to find evidence linking this incident to the unsolved murders, examiners thoroughly vacuumed the car. It was an early model Chevy, the same type as described by witnesses of the previous 2 murders. Thinking it may just be a strange coincidence, Detective Kennecom took a closer look at the tires.
I looked at the right rear tire of the vehicle, and it was in fact like the tire we were looking for. I then went to my attaché case where I carried a copy of the sketch of the tire with certain important measurements, measured the tire on the right rear of the vehicle, saw some oddities with that particular tire, and made a match.
James Kodadich's vehicle was now linked to the abduction site of 25-year-old Deirdre O'Brien, murdered a few weeks before. The killer's 3rd victim became the investigation's prime suspect. To be absolutely certain that the tires matched, investigators turned again to forensic tire expert Pete McDonald. The tire in question is rolled on what's essentially a giant ink pad, leaving an impression of its entire tread circumference on a length of white cardboard. After completing this process on Kodadich's Chevy, investigators sent a negative transparency of the tire impression found at Deirdre O'Brien's abduction site to Peter McDonald. McDonald then compared that to the suspect's tire impression. After 25 hours of scrutiny, McDonald was absolutely certain he'd found what he was looking for.
I was able to make a positive identification because there were many cuts and tears in the tire that were unique to that tire only.
That proved that Kodadich's car was at the scene. The information was enough for investigators to obtain a warrant. Kodadich was still in the hospital when arrested for suspicion of murdering Deirdre O'Brien. When confronted with the tire impression evidence, the suspect admitted making a sharp turn on that stretch of highway, but not at the time of the murder. Though police did not believe him, the evidence was only circumstantial. Investigators had to find another way to build their case. And not just for the murder of Deirdre O'Brien, but also for the murder of 18-year-old Amy Hoffman. They wouldn't need to go very far. The fibers collected from Kodadich's car interior were compared against those found on both victims.
Victims' evidence, such as fibers from skirts, were actually found in his car, and then carpet fibers from his vehicle and foam from the seat cushion was actually found on the victims. So there was a cross-link.
Despite the evidence against him, Kodadich maintained he was not the killer. He pointed to his stab wound as proof. Investigators decided to take a closer look at the injury. The severity and the angle suggested it was self-inflicted.
How many days ago did you get it?
But why did he bother?
We believe that he thought the police might have had an idea or were looking at him as a suspect in the case, which we weren't, but that's why we believed he made this particular scenario up.
But Kodadich's plan backfired and led investigators right to him. Based on the evidence, police believe that Kodadich prowled for vulnerable women to abduct, molest, and kill. For the murders of Amy Hoffman and Deirdre O'Brien, James Kodadich was sentenced to 95 years. Kodadich was difficult to apprehend because his random victims had no connection to him. Most murders aren't random, and the killer goes to great lengths to obliterate the connection between himself and the victim. On May 8, 1993, a young couple at Lake Lou Yeager Park in Illinois frantically summoned the help of the park caretaker. Someone had built a fire in a pile of brush. In the center was what looked like a mannequin. At first, the couple thought it was a prank, but when they looked closer, they realized whoever did this was deadly serious. The body was real. After the body was pulled from the smoldering pile, the police were notified. Police could discern that the victim was female, but that was all. Her head was missing. They retrieved melted trash bags and a charred cardboard carton from the debris. Detective Mike Sheely of the Illinois State Police led the search for more clues.
We brought in Illinois State Police dogs and attempted to search the area for any other possible evidence and the possibility of finding the victim's decapitated head. Those were unsuccessful.
Investigators had no clue who the killer was and no clue to the victim either. They felt confident that the identity of the victim would lead to her killer. This crime was simply too gruesome to be a random attack.
Anyone who'd go to all that trouble to try to burn a body and to decapitate them went to a lot of trouble because of the association between the suspect and the victim.
For now, their best clue was the victim herself. X-rays revealed fibroid tumors in her uterus, severe enough to cause medical problems. The plastic bags were ordinary trash bags. The cardboard carton was from a self-service moving company. Neither seemed like much of a clue. A forensic anthropologist was called in to determine all he could from the victim's bones. Determining an approximate age, height, and the victim's race would be crucial to matching her with a missing persons report. Forensic anthropologist Dr. Mark Johnsey of the Illinois State Police Crime Lab made the analysis.
The pubic symphysis, which is down the pelvic region, is a very good indicator of age. The pelvic bone in this area changes very diagnostically with age, and based on that I could make an assessment of her age, which I gave her an age range of 35 to 39.
Establishing race was more problematic. Flesh tone is distorted in death, and the fire didn't help that. Dr. Johnsey had to rely on his best judgment under difficult circumstances.
Both the pubic hair and the axillary hair in the armpit, which she had both, was very straight. And she was fairly light-skinned, and with a combination of those features, it was just felt that she was a Caucasian.
Now, investigators needed a name. The most certain way of identifying a person is by fingerprints. But that works only if they can be lifted from the victim and if the victim's prints are on file somewhere. Illinois State Police forensic scientist Gary Havey was assigned the task of seeing that this Jane Doe met those requirements. The victim's hands were removed and sent in sealed cans to his lab. They were dry and stiffened in a clutched position. If Havey hoped to raise any prints, he'd have to amputate individual fingers and soften the tissue.
In the case of Jane Doe, in order to soften the tissue, one of the procedures or methods that I have found to be useful over the last years is to actually soak the fingers in a solution of detergent.
The solution softens the tissue on the friction ridges, which are the unique arches, whorls, and loops on every person's fingertips. Once the fingers were softened and dried, Havey rolled them in ink and printed their ridge patterns onto white paper. But he wasn't satisfied.
I didn't want just suitable prints, I wanted the absolute best standard we could achieve. We then decided to utilize a different method in obtaining the friction ridge detail from the fingers and palms. Over the years, I've had good success utilizing black powder and frosted lifting tape.
The powder and tape yielded better results, which were then photographed and labeled. They would then be classified and sent to APHIS, the Automated Fingerprint Identification System in Joliet, Illinois, which holds fingerprint cards for the entire state. Only Jane Doe's left thumb and index fingers were clear enough for the APHIS computer. Usually, that's all it needs.
At this time, there were 1.7 to 1.8 million cards on file in Joliet. It would be totally impossible for me to manually search all of those cards, but with APHIS, we can actually scan those individual cards in a period of 30 minutes upwards to 2 or 3 hours.
The results came back negative. No matches. The victim and her killer remained anonymous. A nameless murder victim was found burning in an Illinois park. Until investigators could determine the identity of the Caucasian woman, her killer would remain free. Desperate for clues, detectives interviewed witnesses who were in the park the night the body was discovered. 2 students, taking a drive after their prom, reported seeing the fire. Nearby was a cargo van. They believed the tags were from Missouri. The back was open, and they could see plastic trash bags. Detectives were convinced the teenagers next saw the killer.
They actually pull alongside the suspect van, and they're quite alarmed that somebody would actually have a fire in this no-burn area. They're familiar with the park, and basically at that point, the suspect sees the car pull alongside, and he immediately runs and jumps into the van and speeds away.
But without a tag number, it was another untraceable lead. To solve this case, investigators had to identify the victim, who they referred to as Janie Doe. They expanded the APHIS fingerprint search.
We performed APHIS searches in over 45 different APHIS systems throughout the United States, Canada, and even Puerto Rico. This would prove to be the most extensive APHIS search ever undertaken by the Illinois State Police.
Millions of prints were scrutinized, and still no leads. The victim apparently had no criminal record and was not on any database. Likewise, hundreds of missing persons reports were scrutinized over a period of more than 18 months. Though none matched the description of a 30-something Caucasian woman whose fingerprints matched Janie Doe's, one name consistently popped up.
The one constant factor that we continued to see was a victim, Lynn Matcham Thomas, from the greater St. Louis area. She had came on our list before, and we had called St. Louis missing persons and also talked to the homicide squad, but we had discounted the fact that this would be our victim because she was African American.
With no other leads, investigators went to speak with Shirley Matcham, the mother of Lynn Matcham Thomas. Like her daughter, she lived in Missouri, only 50 miles from the Illinois park where the victim was found. Shirley had reported Lynn missing the day before the body was found. According to her mother, Lynn had light skin. Like the victim, she also had fibroid tumors that she was seeing a doctor about. In fact, the day she disappeared, her brother had dropped her off at her doctor's office and made arrangements to pick her up afterward. When he returned, he was 10 minutes late. He went inside, but she was no longer there. He assumed that she grew tired of waiting and decided to walk home. He didn't think anything more about it. Later that night, Mrs. Matcham received a call from Lynn's husband, Curtis Thomas, asking where Lynn might be. He said she'd left his house 20 minutes earlier, and he assumed she'd gone to her mother's. But her mother hadn't seen her all day. Shirley Matcham knew her son-in-law to be violent and suspected the worst. The next day, she filed a missing persons report with the St. Louis Police Department. Investigators reviewed the report. They learned that St. Louis police had followed up with a visit to Lynn's home to speak with her husband, Curtis Thomas. He told them that the night Lynn disappeared, she was moving out of the house. He wasn't happy about it, and they fought. The last time he'd seen her, she was walking away from the house. At first, he thought she'd just run off without her things, but when she didn't show up at her mother's, he thought something serious might have happened. Sifting through the report, investigators found another potential clue.
We also found out that when Lynn Matcham Thomas was discovered missing, that the police had went to the Thomas residence and asked for permission to search the house. Mr. Thomas let him in. They conducted a search on the second and first floors, and when the police asked to go to the basement, Mr. Thomas insisted that he call his attorney, and they terminated the search.
With no victim or any signs of foul play, the missing persons investigation in St. Louis ended. But now, almost 2 years later, investigators in Illinois suspected that the body found in the park was Lynn Matcham Thomas. The timing of her disappearance fit. Her medical condition was the same. And her husband, Curtis Thomas, was becoming the prime suspect. Investigators in Illinois struggled to identify a decapitated woman found burning in a state park. Though they believed she was Shirley Matcham Thomas and that her husband Curtis had put her there, they had to prove it. Investigators went back to Lynn's mother for past employment information about her daughter.
And quite to our surprise, she said that her daughter had been employed by a local bank, and during the course of that employment that she had been fingerprinted. So we were able to go to the St. Louis Police Department now and look in a specific file. Those files were not in any database, and manually had to pull those fingerprints to compare them with our Janie Doe.
The comparison was made. Janie Doe was, in fact, Lynn Matcham Thomas. Because of their stormy marriage, their violent history, and the fact that he was the last one to have seen Lynn, Curtis Thomas became the prime suspect. What police needed was proof. Investigators now tried to find a link between evidence left at the crime scene and the suspect. They determined that a cardboard carton pulled from the fire was from the same moving company that the victim was using to pack her belongings. However incriminating, the evidence was only circumstantial. To learn more about Curtis Thomas and his activities following Lynn's disappearance, investigators located an ex-girlfriend who he started seeing after his wife was reported missing. She said that Curtis claimed the police were stupid for misidentifying the race of Janie Doe. This was several weeks before she was identified as African American. She also added that Curtis had access to a van through his work. It matched the description of the van seen at the park the night of the murder. The girlfriend was frightened of Curtis and ended the relationship. That testimony, along with the rest of the circumstantial evidence they gathered, gave investigators enough to arrest Curtis Thomas in January 1995 for suspicion of murdering his wife almost 2 years earlier. A search warrant for his home was issued. Though Thomas insisted he knew nothing about the fate of his estranged wife, investigators found newspaper clippings regarding the mysterious body in Illinois. Police theorized that the abusive Curtis Thomas was unwilling to let his wife simply walk out on him. Investigators believe that after murdering Lynn Matcham Thomas, he kept the body in the basement until he could get the work van. And to throw investigators off his trail, he beheaded the victim, then transported her to the park in Illinois, where he set the remains on fire. Curtis Thomas was found guilty. He was sentenced to life without parole. Thomas tried to erase the connection between himself and the victim. Others try to erase all evidence of the crime itself. On September 14, 1985, a motorist on a secluded highway in Utah pulled over to help a frantic man. David Mosman said his pickup truck went off the road in Logan Canyon and plunged 285 feet to the river below. His wife, Tanya, was still down there. The motorist called for help. Though banged up and visibly shaken, Mosman's injuries were relatively minor. He told emergency workers that his wife was conscious when he'd helped her out of the wreck and onto the shore. He begged them to help her. As David Mosman was transported to the hospital, a rescue team was in the canyon, searching in the dark for his wife. About 40 feet from the overturned vehicle, caught on rocks in the middle of the river, lay Tanya Mosman. She was face down in the water, dead. By the time she was retrieved, David Mosman was in the hospital getting his wounds treated. He told the nurse that he glanced off the road for a second to look at his wife. At that instant, the truck went over. He blamed his carelessness for the accident. Investigators arrived at the hospital. They asked the nurse if David was in any shape to make a statement. She told them that his injuries were minor and he needn't stay there. She said that Mosman told her he'd been thrown from the truck just as it went over the embankment. She considered him lucky to be alive. Investigators waited until the next day to get a detailed account of the accident. When asked about his marriage, David Mosman said that things between him and his wife had been shaky. They were going through a bitter divorce, but lately they were working to save their relationship. That night, he'd taken her to a restaurant. They enjoyed themselves and each other. It was like it used to be before their relationship soured. After dinner, they'd headed home. David Mosman had driven that stretch of road dozens of times before. He said he must have taken his eyes off the road as he approached the curve. He said all he remembered was his wife's screams. Confused and shaken, he made his way to the bottom of the canyon. When he reached Tanya, she was partially ejected from the back of the truck. He helped her out and started back up to get help. Utah Highway Patrol Officer Larry Forsgren worked the accident investigation.
He said he put her on the bank and that she was all right, and he had talked to her and she was fine. He said that she did mention that her head hurt a little bit, but other than that, and he didn't see any blood. She wasn't bleeding, and he put her on the bank so then he'd go up and get help.
Mosman said it took him more than 2 hours to climb up the canyon in the dark. He thought he must have blacked out or fallen asleep in the cold. He didn't know how his wife ended up back in the river. In the days following Tanya Mosman's death, accident reconstruction experts studied the spot where the truck went over. On the pavement was a small scuff mark, showing that the steering wheel was turned abruptly off the road at about 20 to 30 miles per hour. For Cache County Deputy Medical Examiner Sergeant George Becker, that fact presented an inconsistency with David Mosman's account.
At that point, the vehicle would tilt up to go off the road as it's going over the bank. It would have been impossible to get out of the vehicle on the driver's side. You'd have to lift the door straight up and climb out while the vehicle is moving. It's impossible.
The routine analysis of the accident had raised more questions than it answered. For investigators, this case demanded a closer look. Police in Utah continued investigating the tragic death of Tanya Mosman, killed when the truck she and her husband David were driving plunged 285 feet into a canyon. David Mosman's account of the accident didn't jibe with the facts. Investigators requested an autopsy on Tanya Mosman. Water in her lungs showed that her cause of death was drowning. A mark from hip to shoulder suggested she'd been wearing her seatbelt, which would have made it impossible for her to be thrown through the back windshield, as her husband claimed. The only other marks to her body were 3 blunt and distinctive contusions on the back of her head. Looking for answers, the forensics team inspected the truck for what might have caused the marks. They also used chemically treated swabs called hemosticks, which turn blue on contact with traces of blood. No blood was found, and no object in the truck could have caused the victim's contusions. Investigators went back to the scene to gather more information. What they found was a length of sprinkler irrigation pipe entangled on the riverbank. David Mosman, a school teacher, moonlighted as a sprinkler installer. The pipe was sent to Dr. Kent Glanville of the Logan County Police Department Crime Lab for further examination. He placed the pipe over life-sized photographs of the wounds on Tanya's head. The pipe was a perfect fit. But Mosman had a reason to carry it, and, however unlikely, it might have struck the victim during the truck's tumble. With all the inconsistencies and lingering questions, investigators pressed Mosman to try to remember more details of the accident. He was asked to draw a map of the road and to mark where he lost control and went over. He did it with pinpoint accuracy, something most accident victims can't do.
He was exactly sure that this is where he went off, and it was close to the approximate same area that the vehicle went off. And that was kind of odd because when he went off, it was nighttime, it was dark. And for him to pinpoint it, he had to be pretty familiar with that location. And I got the impression that he knew beforehand where that vehicle was going to go off.
Things that I just don't think anything about.
2 days after the accident, that impression was reinforced when a friend of David Mosman's named Terry contacted police.
She's so easy to slip something in a drink or...
He said the couple had a difficult marriage and that David was always joking about how he was going to kill Tanya. Chief Prosecutor Jim Jenkins followed the investigation.
David told Terry that he didn't want to go through the expense of a divorce. He didn't want to risk losing custody of the two children. And he didn't want to give any of the property or finances that he had accumulated.
Now trying to prove that David Mosman had murdered his wife, police began interviewing Tanya's friends. They were well aware of the Mosmans' disintegrating marriage. One friend said that Tanya was often terrified of David. Sometimes he was violent. Mostly they fought over the custody of their two young children. She told investigators that David had recently tried to make Tanya sign a document he'd written, forcing her to relinquish custody of their kids if they divorced. He'd even threatened to kill her if she didn't sign it. Even so, Tanya sought legal advice about getting a divorce. Shortly after that, David began acting very nicely to her. Tanya told her friend that she was looking forward to dinner with her husband. She sincerely believed that on the night she died, they would reconcile. It all seemed tragically convenient for David Mosman, so investigators continued to dig. They discovered that David had had a $10,000 life insurance policy on his wife for many years. But 9 months before her death, while their marriage was crumbling, he took out additional policies for an additional $100,000. A motive was firmly established, and the circumstances of Tanya's death were suspicious. Still, it could have been an improbable accident. Investigators had to prove that it wasn't. David Mosman said he left his injured wife on the riverbank, but she was found in the middle of the river. Investigators hired hydrological engineer Dr. Dave Tullis to see if that was possible.
The deputy wanted me to assess the situation and see if there was any reasonable way that she could have gone from the riverbank, where he said he left her, to the location in the river in the condition that she was in.
Dr. Tullis measured the river's depth, velocity, and direction of the current to calculate if an object as large as a human body could be carried from the bank and deposited at the spot where the victim was found. He determined that the shallow water near the bank couldn't support a body, and even if it could, the speed and direction of the current would carry it along the edge, not to the middle of the river.
If she was unconscious, she couldn't move, and the current would not have been able to move her along, and so she would have been found right by the riverbank in the unconscious condition or drowned condition.
But she wasn't. She had never been taken to the bank of the river, as her husband had said. David Mosman was arrested for suspicion of murdering his wife. Investigators believe that David Mosman tried to kill Tanya in the premeditated crash. But when she survived, he had to climb down the canyon and finish the job. The motive, apparently, was hatred of his wife, custody of his children, and $110,000 in insurance. For his crimes, David Mosman was sentenced to life in prison. Prisons are filled with people who thought they'd committed the perfect crime. But a murder isn't over once the victim is dead. For investigators, that's just the beginning. They turn to forensic scientists to help bring justice to the victims by exposing a killer's fatal error.
Okay.
A Missouri man is shot in the head on a deserted country road. Is it murder? The only clue, a shredded bullet. Identifying the gun that fired it will be nearly impossible. In Florida, a man is beaten to death in his home. Police uncover fingerprints and rumors of an exotic weapon.
That's what it looks like.
For law enforcement, the toughest opponent is often an assassin with no clear ties to the victim. Using science as their most powerful weapon, investigators must find these hired killers and make them pay the true price of murder. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. Hillsboro, Missouri is a small town located a few miles west of the Mississippi River. On November 21st, 2000, on a stretch of commercial property owned by a chemical manufacturing plant just outside Hillsboro, a security guard spotted a vehicle sitting in a field. He discovered a man in the driver's seat, slumped over the steering wheel. The man was unresponsive. He was bleeding from a wound in the back of his head. The security guard called 911.
Jefferson County 911, what is your emergency? A man in a field?
A dispatcher alerted units from the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department.
7214, 6017.
Within minutes, paramedics and deputies were on the scene. But for the man who lay motionless in the driver's seat, it was too late. Paramedics pronounced him dead at the scene. Sheriff's deputies cordoned off the area and called in crime scene investigators. Detective William McDaniel took charge of the case.
When I pulled up, there was a car partially off a gravel roadway, had a white male slumped at the wheel. The rear passenger side window was shattered. It looked like from a bullet. The security guard found him.
Okay, I guess what we'll do then.
The evidence suggested to Detective Michael Gray the car was moving when the man was shot.
Do it here.
When the vehicle was found, it was in gear. His foot was still on the brake pedal. We surmised that the vehicle was traveling at idle speed. We initially were looking at the possibility of it being hunting related simply because of the time of year. The area in question is known for a lot of hunting.
Detectives examined the car inside and out in search of any clues. Some 30 feet away on the dirt road, investigators found shards of glass. They believe the bullet struck the car and driver here, after which he drove straight off the road. The driver was removed from the vehicle and identified by his license. His name was Larry Holman, a 44-year-old from nearby Hillsboro. The victim's wife was contacted. Detective McDaniel knew the victim from around town. He was a church-going family man, not a man prone to have many enemies.
Open up the right door.
He was also an avid hunter.
Yeah, I pulled from down the road. The security guard revealed that the subject was in the field area scouting for deer for possible hunting locations. It's the last day of deer season, and there had been reports of poachers on the property. The car is in a field where the deer cross, so there's a chance that somebody may have thought it was a deer moving across the field.
Detectives turned to forensics to find the source of the deadly shot.
Well, the important thing was to try to determine the direction the projectile came from. Once we got a direction, we'd have a line on where to search for any items of forensic evidence, any shell casings, items left behind. That's why it was important to try to position everything back in its original location. We repositioned the vehicle back on the road. We figured out a trajectory angle based upon the approximate head height of the gentleman. It was a matter of setting up a tripod, taking a trajectory string, and then just extrapolating back into the wooded area.
Holman had been shot from behind, the bullet passing through the window and the car's headrest before killing him.
Okay, that's good.
Police used this information to reconstruct the bullet's path.
We ran the trajectory angle back from the vehicle at about 40 to 50 feet away near the wood line. The trajectory string was at about shoulder height, which would be consistent with an individual taking aim or firing with a weapon.
I like that. What do you think?
Be right real close.
Investigators scoured the woods in that area, looking for potential evidence left by a careless hunter. But police came up empty-handed. No shell casings, cigarette butts, or any clues to help explain what happened. A sheriff's deputy interviewed the security guard at the entrance to the property. He was the last person to see Larry Holman alive. Police hoped the guard might recall some small clue to help them find the killer. The guard had known the victim. Larry had worked there and hunted on the property often. On the day of his death, Larry Holman arrived alone and in good spirits. It was his day off work, and he told the guard he would be out in the field scouting for deer. According to a sign-in sheet,
Yes, sir, it is.
Holman had entered the property at 4:20 in the afternoon.
Holman there. Yes, sir.
He would never sign out.
Correct. Mrs. Holman?
Yes.
Police spoke with the victim's wife, Tammy, to see if she could shed any additional light on the investigation.
I need to speak to you about your husband.
I don't understand.
She said she had last seen him the morning he was killed. The couple had been married nearly 15 years. She described her marriage as happy and could think of no one who wished Larry harm. She wasn't able to provide any additional information. An autopsy was performed, though it offered few clues that could point to a perpetrator. According to the coroner's report, Larry Holman died instantly. A high-velocity slug was retrieved from his skull, but it was unidentifiable. The bullet's lead core was gone. Only a mangled copper jacket survived. Investigators hope to recover more pieces of the bullet in the victim's car.
See if we can preserve that.
The projectile, it had fragmented when it penetrated the glass. When we processed the vehicle, we found some fragments from the projectile embedded in the headrest of the driver's seat. So we decided to retrieve that in the attempt to try to determine the caliber of the weapon and maybe the ammunition that was used.
At the Missouri State Highway Patrol Crime Lab, Forensics expert Todd Garrison was charged with putting the bullet back together again.
First, it hit a window of an automobile. Secondary impact was the headrest of the automobile. The third impact was the victim's head. Each one of those impacts contributing a little bit more to its damage and distortion.
Garrison analyzed the size and weight of the pieces.
One of the copper fragments out of the headrest had rifling engraving on it that was similar to the rifling engraving that was observed on the bullet out of the victim's head.
He determined that he was looking at pieces of a .243 caliber bullet.
Generally, the .243 Winchester caliber is associated with a hunting type rifle, as for deer, large game.
At the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department, detectives formed a task force. If this was a hunting accident, it would be nearly impossible to solve.
Guys, watch.
Thousands of hunters passed through the area.
It's basically 30-40 feet out.
Detective Gray laid out what little they did know.
Okay, so you're saying about
You have an individual who's what we term low risk. The guy's a family man. The guy had no known enemies. Did not live a lifestyle that would be conducive to violence.
Investigators, however, were not yet willing to declare the case an
I think
accident.
I'm going to take the four names I got. The wood line,
Something didn't seem right.
glass, which we
Accidental shots usually end up somewhere else on the body. Headshots are usually an aimed shot. When you start thinking about the laws of probability, we have a moving target, small rear window, the thickness of the woods. It did not look like an accident.
I think we need to go out and maybe talk to some residents.
Police officially labeled the death suspicious, but they had no leads to point them to the killer.
Go back out to the woods.
It seemed the investigators had come to the end of their trail of evidence. Weeks turned into months, and no new clues surfaced. Police issued press releases throughout the small community, asking the public for help. By January, little headway had been made on the case. Then, police got a break from an unlikely source.
Hi, Detective. Okay.
Tammy Holman, the victim's widow, told investigators about a series of unsettling letters she had been receiving.
Yes, I did. It's weird.
After her husband was shot, a man named Carter Davis began writing her love letters.
You know, it's just kind of fishy.
Tammy said she had rebuffed him, but he would not leave her alone. She turned his letters over to police. "I love you and won't let you go," read one. "We're soulmates," read another. The detective's interview with Holman's widow left them with some questions.
Wouldn't say who he was.
No, he wouldn't say who he was.
They knew that a man named Alan Tripp had moved in with her shortly after her husband was killed.
Mrs. Holman started to look suspicious to us. Her actions didn't really correspond with a grieving widow. It began to expand our investigation.
Detectives ran Tammy's name through the system. Her record was clean. But they also knew her name did appear on another significant document. Larry Holman's insurance policy offered a payout of $125,000. He had an additional policy of $2 million if he died in a hunting accident. The beneficiary was his wife. For detectives, what started as a simple accident was now looking like it might be cold-blooded murder. In November 2000, Missouri deer hunter Larry Holman was found dead in a field. He'd been shot in the head with a .243 caliber bullet fired from a hunting rifle. At first, it appeared as if it was an accident, but police were beginning to have their doubts. They weren't the only ones. In January 2001, the victim's brother, Randy Holman, turned in a .243 Winchester bolt-action rifle. He knew the police were looking for that type of weapon and suspected Larry's death was no accident. Randy feared the killer was someone his brother knew who may have used this gun to murder him.
Okay. If you want to have a seat right there.
Jefferson County Detective William McDaniel.
We interviewed Randy Holman, brother of Larry Holman. He actually brought in a deer rifle of Larry's, and he wanted us to do a comparison of the deer rifle to the ballistic round, what was found at the crime scene.
At the time of the murder, the gun had been stored at the home of Larry and Tammy Holman. Randy had good reason to suspect his brother was murdered. He told police his brother Larry had been shot at before.
We were at my parents' place.
Days before his death, Larry had gone hunting deep in the Missouri woods.
Randy stated that he and Larry had had a conversation later in the night after hunting. Larry stated that he had a close call. And Randy asked, well, what do you mean by a close call? And he goes, well, I had a bullet whiz by my head. Because there was so much gun activity up in the northern part of Missouri during deer season. And they kind of joked about it.
But now he knew it was no joke and wondered if Larry had been shot with his own gun.
Heavily hunted. I didn't think much about it.
He just wished that that gun would be ruled out so that way he knew the gun had no involvement into his brother's death. Alan, thanks for coming by.
Investigators sent the gun to ballistics and began interviewing suspects. First on their list was Alan Tripp, the widow's new love interest.
You know what we want to talk to you about?
Tripp had grown up with Tammy Holman and came to her side shortly after Larry's death.
Oh, I've known her since grade school. We went to grade school together.
Within the last couple months, Alan Tripp had moved in with Mrs. Holman and actually gave her an engagement ring.
No.
His actions raised some red flags with us. He stated he had no knowledge of the incident, that he had spoke to Mrs. Holman several times about the so-called accident, and she stated that there was nothing there.
Calling her all the time.
Investigators also sought out a local man named Carter Davis.
Yeah, he's right over there clearing that table.
Tammy said Davis had become infatuated with her, showering her with flowers and love letters.
I need to ask you some questions about
Letters that concerned Tammy Holman. Like Tripp, he insisted he had nothing to do with the crime.
Tammy and I are friends.
At one time, Carter Davis actually put a note on Alan Tripp's car which said, "Did you kill him?"
She's always said
and he just believed that Alan Tripp had something to do with his death.
But other than that, she's never said much.
Police had also gotten a very interesting lead. They learned that Tripp and Davis were not the only men close to Tammy Holman.
We received an anonymous phone call. It was a male subject.
The caller suggested they check out the alibi of a third man.
It was a male caller?
The tipster said Charles Miller had a gun similar to the one police were looking for. McDaniel checked Miller's record for any previous arrests. Miller had a record. He had been arrested for check fraud. A few days later, on January 9th, 2001, investigators caught another break.
Okay, thank you. Have a seat.
Nice to meet you.
A woman gave police new information on the case.
Some information I don't know if you can use.
She told Detective McDaniel that she lived near the field where Holman was shot. For several days leading up to the crime, she observed a suspicious-looking man with a gun walking near the crime scene. McDaniel showed the woman a lineup. She identified Charles Miller without hesitation.
Yeah, right there, I'm sure.
Within hours, they had their man in sight.
Miller!
Charles Miller was arrested and brought in for questioning. He admitted he was a friend of the Holmans, but claimed to know nothing of the crime.
He's good.
They had attended Sunday schools together. Miller would come over and do work around the Holman's house. He would bring eggs, he would bring, bacon, and so Tammy would cook breakfast in the morning for him and Larry.
Miller offered to cooperate with investigators.
Mr. Miller gave us permission to do a consent to search on firearms that he had owned. We were only looking for high-powered rifles, and he actually gave us 3 rifles, one being a Browning Bolt A-Action 243.
Deputies also seized boxes of .243 caliber ammunition and cell phone records, which indicated that Miller had called the Holman residence on the day of the crime.
Once the gun was seized from Charlie Miller during the consent to search, it was delivered to the Missouri State Highway Patrol Crime Lab in Jeff City for a ballistic match.
Criminalist Todd Garrison examined Miller's rifle, as well as Larry Holman's gun brought in by his brother Randy.
I test fired both of the rifles in question. From those, I obtained bullets, which I could do microscopic comparisons between. I eliminated the .243 Winchester caliber Savage rifle.
The rifle taken from the victim's home was not involved. That left Charles Miller's gun. There were key similarities, but damage to the bullet recovered from the body prevented a 100% match.
I did observe the rifling engraving and also isolated agreements of some individual characteristics. Not enough to say, yes, this firearm did fire this bullet, but enough that it was consistent with that particular firearm.
The forensics seemed to point squarely at Charles Miller. He was now their prime suspect. Miller, already in custody, was interrogated by Detective McDaniel.
Is there something that we need to talk about? He was not a very emotional person. He asked us questions if this was about his gun. We explained to him, yes, it was about his gun we seized. And he bowed his head and he looked back up and he said, I killed him.
I killed him.
It took us all for a shock. And we find out later, Mr. Miller was a very church-going person, and I believe this was eating him up inside.
You know what kind of
Police now had a confession, but what Miller was about to tell them would blow the case wide open.
Who owns a 243?
In Jefferson County, Missouri, an accident investigation had uncovered a homicide. Police had a suspect in custody, Charles Miller.
Charlie, you know why we're here?
And when presented with the forensic evidence, he confessed. But the confession was only the beginning.
Charles Miller got, I guess, infatuated with Mrs. Holman. He stated to us that he always thought she was a very well-kept woman. He and Mrs. Holman began a relationship without Mr. Holman's knowledge.
Miller told police he and Tammy were close, and her husband was becoming concerned.
I thought
Tammy knew that you killed
He went on to say Tammy asked him to kill Larry.
Tammy's the one who made
She wanted it done during hunting season to make it appear as if it was an accident. Miller believed that with Larry dead, he and Tammy would be free to live the life he dreamed of.
Tammy while I still had the gun.
Miller had tried once and missed. November 21st was his last chance, the final day of hunting season.
Mr. Miller got down to the property about 2 o'clock and actually watched Mr. Holman drive into the field. Miller was up the road a ways and positioned against a tree. And as Mr. Holman started to leave the property, he took the shot. And he watched Mr. Holman slump, his head go forward and rest on the steering wheel, and the car veered off.
Police believe he then packed up his rifle, picked up his shell casings, and left the scene. It was then that he made the call to Tammy Holman.
He told her to set one less place at the dinner table.
On January 10, 2001, detectives arrested Tammy Holman for the murder of her husband.
Tammy? Charlie Miller was basically double-crossed by Mrs. Holman. He thought he was going to get to live the life that Larry Holman lived, and instead she pulls Alan Tripp in, who is now taking over Larry's position in the family. She was a black widow, and she had all these lovers out there, and she kind of used them all to do her dirty work for her.
Charles Miller pled guilty to second-degree murder and is serving a 25-year prison sentence. Tammy Holman was sentenced to 7 years in prison for conspiracy to commit murder. A sniper's bullet will often give him away, but a hitman who uses a more obscure weapon poses an added challenge for police. November 7th, 1995, 8:31 p.m. A 911 dispatcher received a frantic call from a woman in Green Cove Springs, Florida.
We'll get somebody out there, okay?
The caller, Linda Jones, reported that 3 men had broken in and ransacked her home. Jones said that she had been tied up, her husband severely beaten. Deputies from the Clay County Sheriff's Department rushed to the address. On the lookout for 3 intruders, they approached the home with caution.
I'm so glad you guys are here.
I need you to come back over this way.
I want to get in with my husband.
I just need for you to wait for me. Tell me what's going on.
A deputy secured the living room. The assailants appeared to have fled. Linda's husband, Jack Jones, lay on the floor in a puddle of blood, his hands and feet bound with duct tape. He was not breathing. The deputy began CPR. Distraught and inconsolable, his wife could offer few lucid details. Paramedics rushed onto the scene. As deputies tried to gain a description of the attackers, they did not have much to go on. Linda said the men wore ski masks. The rest was a blur. Lieutenant Tom Waugh was assigned the case.
We were told that 3 masked assailants entered the residence. They had some kind of a club or bat with them, and they had tied up her husband, and literally beat him with this weapon. And then they went through the residence and stole various items, such as money and jewelry.
Paramedics examined Linda Jones. Her injuries seemed minor. She complained of tingling and pain in her left arm and was taken to a local hospital for treatment. Her husband was not as fortunate. Jack Jones was dead.
The crime scene itself was very violent.
We noticed right off the bat a lot of blood. There was blood on the floor, because there was blood spatter on the wall, and it appears that he was drugged into an adjacent room. And on the wall, as he rounded the corner, it looked as if he had his hands on the door corner trying to hold himself back. And then once he was in the other room, that is where he was literally beaten to death.
Pieces of duct tape were scattered throughout the house, along with a partially used roll. Officials believed it had likely been used on the wife. She too had been tied up, she told deputies, but tore herself free before calling police. The reason for the break-in appeared less clear the more detectives looked around. Valuables were found in plain view.
It was made to look like it was ransacked, you know, just disheveled.
Jewelry, an expensive watch, a man's wallet with cash and credit cards were all left behind.
Those are the things that you can turn the fastest. They would have been gone. And why would you leave money? Why would you leave jewelry? Didn't seem right.
At the hospital, deputies took a statement from Linda Jones
Jack and I were sitting in the living room.
and fingerprints to help eliminate those found at the house.
Break short,
She claimed her wrists were tied and her mouth sealed shut with duct tape. But something about her story didn't sit right with detectives.
They threw me against the fire.
You would have some signs of that. There wasn't any redness on her mouth or her face. That didn't seem quite right, because normally duct tape will leave a residue, or they'll leave a redness when you snatch that thing off.
Police were left with many questions. An autopsy provided few answers. The coroner's report revealed broken ribs, skull fractures, and severe contusions from the knees to the top of his head. Lieutenant Jim Redmond recalls the official findings.
The injuries to Jack Jones were as a result of blunt force trauma. The injuries were indicative of a bat or some type of club.
The brutality of the crime sent shockwaves throughout the community. Detectives were baffled.
The Joneses lived in a nice neighborhood in the Lake Asbury area of Clay County. Why did somebody pick out this house? In this affluent neighborhood, quiet, peaceful, very peaceful, quiet neighborhood. Why did they just pick this house out at random to come in and commit this crime? It just wasn't right. Come on, Linda.
Investigators hoped Jones's widow might shed some light on the case. Her response, however, surprised them.
Linda felt a need to have an attorney right away and indicated that we couldn't contact her.
Her behavior, though legal, seemed odd.
Why would she get an attorney? You know, why would a victim whose husband was murdered, why would she need an attorney?
Investigators began canvassing the neighborhood. They hoped someone might have seen something that would pinpoint the killer.
We learned of Jack and Linda's relationship from various people, and it was a stormy relationship. Supposedly, they just weren't happy.
According to neighbors, Jack Jones was having an affair, and Linda had discovered it. One neighbor noticed a suspicious vehicle parked outside the Joneses' residence at the time of the murder.
It was a maroon van, and it had dark tinted windows. And it left the scene, high rate of speed, no lights on.
In nearby Jacksonville, police tracked down Samantha Thomas, the girlfriend of Jack Jones. The two had been romantically involved for several months. The young woman claimed that Jack was planning to divorce his wife. But Linda had threatened suicide. The girlfriend also told police of another incident 1 week before the murder. On October 31st, outside her home, Thomas's car was vandalized, the tires slashed. It could have been just a Halloween prank. But according to his girlfriend, Jack Jones felt differently.
Jack felt like
Linda was behind it just due to all the ruckus she was raising about Samantha and his relationship.
The story seemed a bit odd, but Waugh's next find only increased his suspicions. According to their insurance policy, Linda Jones would receive $500,000 in the event of her husband's death. It was a compelling motive, but to prove murder, investigators would have to turn to the evidence. Though Linda Jones maintained her silence, the duct tape spoke volumes. Dawn Walters, a crime analyst with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, examined scraps of tape collected by police at the crime scene. Minute details grabbed her attention.
Some of the duct tape that was submitted was pulled apart or torn apart, and some of the duct tape that was submitted appeared to have been cut.
Duct tape found on the victim was stretched and frayed, signs that the man had struggled to break free. Tape wrapped around the wrists of his wife, however, bore a tiny triangular pattern.
The duct tape was determined to have been cut by what appeared to be pinking shears or another similar cutting instrument.
Walters also looked for fingerprints, but none were visible. At least, not to the naked eye.
I decided to use the cyanoacrylate ester fuming process, otherwise known as the superglue process. The superglue fuming process is done by adding superglue drops to sodium hydroxide soaked cotton, which then begins to fume, and these fumes will adhere to the latent print residue that's present on an item. Then I used white fingerprint powder to further enhance the prints.
Within seconds, an image came into view. Linda Jones had not torn the duct tape from her wrists. And now police had not one, but 2 fingerprints to prove it. Someone had cut her free on the night of the murder. In 1995, Florida police were on the hunt for 3 masked intruders who bludgeoned a man in his home. After weeks of investigation, Lieutenant Tom Waugh had just 2 significant clues. A pair of fingerprints left at the scene, and a mysterious maroon van. The van remained unidentified. The fingerprints matched no one on file. According to information gathered by police, the victim was a used car salesman with no known enemies and a marriage on the rocks. Waugh suspected the victim's wife was involved, but she could not have acted alone.
Not too far into this investigation after the death of Jack Jones, I had felt like that this was going to be a murder for hire.
Police then got a tip that confirmed their suspicions.
Camera, there was a diamond ring.
An anonymous source accused a local man of being involved in the crime. He was a landscaper named Donald Bradley. Police took a closer look at him.
We determined that Donald Bradley owned a maroon van with dark tinted windows.
The description of the van matched the one police were looking for. A review of his landscaping business finances led to the accounting office in Jacksonville, where Linda Jones worked.
Linda Jones did Donald Bradley's taxes and did work for him. She knew him, and boom, right away, he was coming into focus in this case. One of the things I do routinely when somebody is identified as a suspect, I would start finding out who are they calling.
In Donald Bradley's case, it was not only who, but when.
This is the night of the murder. I got Donald Bradley's cell phone.
Cell phone records indicated he'd made 3 calls to the Jones house on November 7th, all around the time the crime occurred.
This is right in the middle of a
On January 22nd, 1996, Lieutenants Tom Waugh and Jim Redmond interviewed their suspect at his home in Orange Park, Florida.
Sheriff's Office, Lieutenant Jim Redmond.
Bradley admitted he knew the Joneses, but said he had no knowledge of the crime. He told police he'd been out driving for part of the evening in question.
What was the last four?
When we talked with him that day, he was very arrogant.
Detectives soon revealed their hand.
Okay, well, we got a 911 call.
When we started telling him about the phone calls to the house, he said, yes, it was concerning taxes. And then he was very, very nervous, and you could tell he kind of didn't know where to go but hold his composure. I would ask him, Donald, how could Linda be talking about taxes with you on the telephone when she's duct taped and her husband's being beat to death and some guy's sitting on her in the living room of their house? I mean, how could this happen? And he couldn't answer that.
For Lieutenant Redmond, Donald Bradley's story was unbelievable.
We felt pretty confident at that point that he was somehow involved with the murder of Jack Jones.
All the detectives had was a hunch. To make an arrest, they needed evidence. They got a search warrant to seize Bradley's van. Blood, hair, carpet fibers. Investigators searched for anything that might link Donald Bradley to the killing of Jack Jones. But the van was spotless. It had been scrubbed clean. Detectives caught a break several weeks later when Bradley was arrested on an unrelated charge. They interrogated the suspect, who changed his story slightly. He admitted Linda Jones had approached him to kill her husband. But he claimed he had refused.
Bradley made up a story about Linda having murdered Jack Jones and used this African war club to do it with.
His story seemed implausible. But with his fingerprints now in the system, they could finally compare his prints to those found on the duct tape. For investigators, it was one step forward, 2 steps back. Bradley's prints did not match, which meant at least one more accomplice was still on the loose. In 1995, Florida officials believed that Linda Jones had hired a local landscaper named Donald Bradley to kill her husband. But an unidentified fingerprint indicated that at least one other man had taken part in the crime. In September 1996, Jeremy Harrison, a longtime employee of Bradley's landscaping business, had been picked up on an unrelated charge. Police wanted to talk with him about the Jones murder. Prosecutor Timothy Collins.
Mrs. Jones' initial report at the time of the homicide was that 3 individuals were involved. I think what you generally find in these kind of cases is that in every lie there's a thread of truth. So in looking at the crime scene, it was pretty clear that more than one person was involved.
Man, a long time.
It was then a matter of trying to determine who and how many other people were with him.
All right, 15 years.
Would you stand up for me?
So the critical decision then was to find that fingerprint, who it belonged to.
Fingerprint specialist Dawn Walters received Harrison's ink print to compare with evidence on file.
To compare latent prints, I looked for the individual characteristics that are present in the latent print and the inked print. Characteristics such as dots and ending ridges and bifurcations. I was able to identify the 2 latent fingerprints on the tape.
The prints belonged to Jeremy Harrison. Finally, they had their proof. They presented what they had found to Harrison. he started to talk.
He had no problems in telling us that he was involved in the murder and that Bradley was involved in the murder. But there was a third person, and he wouldn't discuss who that third person was, and he was holding back for a reason.
Harrison wouldn't point his finger at the third suspect. It seemed the investigator had hit another brick wall. Then they learned of a family connection that seemed likely to provide them with the break they so desperately needed.
It was shortly thereafter that we learned of his brother.
Jonathan Harrison was picked up for questioning.
We left the door open in the interview room, and we let his brother walk by. And his brother looked at him and said, "I told him everything, give it up, bro."
After eluding suspicion for nearly a year, both Jeremy and Jonathan Harrison confessed. According to the Harrison brothers, the weapon used on the night of the crime was an ancient Zulu warrior stick.
Yeah?
The artifact had been stolen from a local man who hunted big game in Africa. The hunter provided a full description of the club, but it was never recovered by police. On September 14, 1996, law enforcement officials arrested Donald Bradley and charged him with murder and conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree. That same day, investigators closed in on Linda Jones. A woman betrayed by an unfaithful spouse and her own unrestrained brutality.
Linda Jones wanted her husband back. When she finally came to the conclusion that that was never going to happen, then it became a matter of money.
Will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to have an attorney.
And I guess in her own mind, she felt like she was not going to get the kind of money she desired from a divorce.
Investigators pieced together the events that led to Jack Jones's murder.
According to the brothers, Donald had contacted him. He said he would pay him $100 apiece to go beat this guy up, and that's what they thought they were going to do.
Donald Bradley had other plans. After calling Linda Jones several times that evening, making sure their victim was in place, the Harrison brothers burst through the front door, which Linda had left unlocked. Bradley attacked from a side entrance. Bradley grabbed the Zulu warrior stick and proceeded to bludgeon the man in a ruthless fury. Linda's wrists were taped and then cut free, and the men disappeared into the night.
Go out that way.
Later that evening, the men destroyed all evidence, burning the ski masks, their bloody clothes, and the Zulu Warrior Club. Jeremy and Jonathan Harrison pled guilty to felony third-degree murder. They were sentenced to 10 years, 6 months. A jury found Donald Bradley guilty of murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and burglary with a firearm. He was sentenced to die in the electric chair. Linda Jones was found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole. In a murder for hire, police must not only ID a killer, but the guilty party who concocted the crime. Life insurance, cell phone calls, and suspect behavior provide guideposts for police. But it's often the tiniest evidence that speaks the loudest, and a microscope that shows who must pay the price of murder.